Hello, everyone, in Mr. Martin's IB biology class.
Hi there.
Today, we're going to jump into some really big questions, actually. We've been looking at information that sort of helps us figure out what features allow ecosystems to stay stable, healthy for really long time.
Yeah, like centuries, millennia even.
Yeah.
And also, what changes that we humans cause might threaten that stability.
Exactly. So let's explore those key ideas together in this
Ooh,
deep dive.
sounds good. We've gathered info that really shows two sides. How nature can be incredibly tough, keeping these complex systems going, but also how our actions can put serious pressure on them.
And we'll touch on how ecosystems change naturally, too, right? That whole process called succession.
That's right, ecological succession. We'll get into that.
Okay, so think of this as us trying to build a really solid picture of stability and change in ecosystems. We've looked at materials covering the basics, what they need to just survive, but also the more complex stuff like recovery after disturbances, pollution effects. Our goal is really just to make it clear and hopefully interesting for you all, breaking down these potentially tricky topics.
Definitely. So let's kick things off. That first question. What are the key things that let an ecosystem stay stable for ages? Our info points to a few must-haves.
Okay, let's start with, well, the really obvious one, maybe energy. Seems like you need a constant supply.
Absolutely essential.
Yeah.
And for pretty much every ecosystem on Earth, that energy, yeah, it comes from the sun.
Right, it just drives everything.
It really does.
Mm.
And alongside energy, you absolutely need nutrients to be cycled continuously.
Ah, okay. Like carbon, nitrogen, that kind of thing?
Exactly. Carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus. These elements have to move through the living things, the soil, the water, the air,
Yeah.
back to the living things.
So it's reused, like a natural recycling program.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. A kind of circular economy within nature itself.
Cool. Okay, what else? I saw something about genetic diversity being important. Why is variety within a species so crucial?
Ah, good question. Well, high genetic diversity means lots of different gene versions within a population.
Yeah.
And that variety, it gives the species as a whole a much better chance to adapt if the environment throws a curveball.
Like changes in temperature or a disease.
Exactly. If conditions change, some individuals might just happen to have the right genetic traits to survive, reproduce, and pass those helpful genes on. It's like having, diverse toolkit.
Right, right. Different tools for different problems. Makes sense. And the last big one seemed to be a relatively stable climate.
Yes, definitely. Consistent patterns of temperature, rainfall, things staying within the tolerance range for the organisms living there. Big sudden swings can really stress an ecosystem out.
And it's kind of amazing how long some have lasted.
Oh, it's incredible. We found information talking about ecosystems persisting for literally millions of years.
Millions, wow.
Yeah, the lowland rainforest in Borneo, for instance.
Yeah.
Apparently around 140 million years old,
That's just mind-boggling.
isn't it? And a bit closer in time, there's a forest in Switzerland, the Budmerwald, that established itself about 7,000 years ago. Still going strong.
7,000 years. Okay, so long-term stability is definitely possible.
For sure. Now, let's maybe shift gears a little and talk about how ecosystems do change naturally over time. Which brings us to ecological succession.
Okay, ecological succession. Break that down for us. What is it, basically?
Basically, yeah, it's the process of how the community of living things in an area changes over time.
Mhm.
It tends to happen in a somewhat orderly, predictable way.
Orderly, like steps.
Kind of. You can think of it in stages. Often it starts with what's called a pioneer community.
Pioneers, like
Yeah.
the first ones there.
Exactly. The first hardy species that can colonize a really barren environment. Think bare rock, maybe after volcano erupts.
Ah, okay, so like starting from absolute scratch.
That's primary succession, yeah,
Right.
starting from essentially nothing. And those pioneers, often things like bacteria, lichens, they're super
What
important.
do they do?
They start breaking down the rock. They begin the incredibly slow process of creating soil,
Wow, okay, so these tiny things are literally building the foundation for everything else.
pretty much. And as they do their thing, and maybe die and decompose, a thin layer of soil forms. Then you might get small plants, like herbs, whose roots can take hold.
And then bigger things follow.
Right. As the soil gets deeper and richer over time, you see more and different types of species moving in. Biodiversity increases, the total amount of living stuff, primary production goes up, food webs get more complex, nutrient cycling becomes more efficient.
So it builds up complexity.
Yeah, eventually you might get shrubs, and then maybe trees, depending on the climate.
Okay, so that's primary succession.
Right.
From bare rock. What about secondary succession? Sounds different.
It is, yeah. Secondary succession happens when an existing community is disturbed, But, and this is key, the soil remains.
Oh, okay. Like after a forest fire, the trees burn down, but the ground's still there.
Perfect example. Or maybe an old farm field that's abandoned. The recovery, the succession process, it's usually much faster
Right.
because you've already got that soil foundation.
Right, makes sense. Not starting from zero. It's more like rebuilding with some stuff already in place.
Exactly.
Now, I also saw something about cyclical succession. Does that mean it goes in circles?
It can, yeah. Some ecosystems don't just head towards one single stable endpoint. Instead, they go through repeating patterns of change,
Repeating.
often linked to regular disturbances.
Yeah.
Different groups of species become dominant, then get replaced, then maybe come back again in a cycle.
Okay, example.
Sure. Think about the Australian bush. It has pretty regular fire cycles, right?
Yeah, you hear about bushfires a lot.
Well, those fires actually drive a continuous replacement of the community. It
Yeah.
doesn't just reach one final state and stay there. Some plants, like certain grass trees, actually flower because of the fire. They're early colonizers after a burn.
Huh. So the fire isn't just destruction, it's actually part of the system's rhythm.
In many cases, yes, it's part of the cycle. Another example is on rocky shores in New Zealand, there's a cycle involving different barnacles and algae replacing each other.
Interesting. So not always a straight line to a final climax. But you did mention climax communities earlier. What defines that?
Right, so a climax community is generally seen as the relatively stable endpoint of succession for a particular environment.
Yeah.
It's the community that's kind of in balance or equilibrium with the prevailing conditions, like the climate.
The ecosystem that's just best fit for the long term in that spot.
That's the general idea, yeah.
Mm.
But, and this is important, humans can interfere with that.
Mhm.
This leads to something called arrested succession, or sometimes plagioclimax.
Arrested, like stopped. Humans stop it from reaching its natural climax.
Exactly. Our activities can prevent the natural progression and maintain the ecosystem at an earlier stage, creating a different kind of stable community.
How? Give me an example.
Okay, a really common one is grazing by farm animals. Sheep, cattle.
How does that stop succession?
Well, the animals are constantly eating, right? They eat the grasses, but they also eat young shrubs or tree seedlings that try to grow,
Ah, they nip them in the bud, literally.
pretty much. Plus, their hooves can trample small plants. So even if the climate could eventually support a woodland or forest, the constant grazing pressure keeps it stuck as a grassland.
So the animals act like a continuous disturbance, holding it back. Okay. Any other examples?
Another big one is draining wetlands, swamps, bogs, places like that.
Okay, what happens there?
Wetlands have unique plant communities adapted to waterlogged, often low oxygen soil. They're also really important carbon sinks. They store a lot of carbon.
Right. And draining them.
When you drain them, remove the water, the soil conditions totally change. It becomes drier, more oxygen gets in. This allows completely different plants, ones that like drier conditions, to move in and establish themselves.
So you lose the natural wetland community.
Yep. You end up with maybe a grassland or some kind of woodland, depending on what grows. It's a stable community, but it's not the natural climax that would have been there without us draining it. And you lose that carbon storage function, too.
Wow. Okay, so our actions can really shape the final form of an ecosystem, sometimes without us even meaning to stop succession. Which leads us nicely to our second big question. How do human activities actually threaten the stability of these systems?
Yeah, unfortunately, there are quite a few ways. Let's start with a big one, deforestation. And the Amazon rainforest is a critical example here.
The Amazon, yeah. It's massive. What's the specific threat to its stability from cutting down trees?
Well, one really crucial thing trees do there is release huge amounts of water vapor into the atmosphere through transpiration.
Okay.
This process actually helps create clouds and rainfall, not just locally, but over large areas. It also helps keep things cooler.
So fewer trees means less rain.
Potentially, yes. If you remove large areas of forest, you reduce that transpiration, which can lead to less rainfall, longer dry seasons, more drought.
And drought increases fire risk, right?
Exactly. And fires kill more trees, which means even less transpiration, less rain. It can become a dangerous feedback loop.
A vicious cycle.
Yes, a positive feedback loop that can be really hard to reverse. There's concern the Amazon could reach a tipping point where it shifts from rainforest to more of a savanna-like state, just because of this deforestation feedback. Given its size and importance for weather patterns, that's hugely worrying.
That sounds incredibly serious. Okay, what else? What other human impacts harm stability?
Well, Directly removing species through things like poaching or overhunting can obviously disrupt food webs. It also reduces genetic diversity, making populations more vulnerable.
Makes sense.
And then there's eutrophication, especially in water bodies.
Eutrophication, that word again. Too many nutrients, right? Usually from farms.
That's often the main source, yeah. Nitrogen and phosphate from fertilizers wash off fields into rivers and lakes.
And that causes algae blooms.
Precisely. These excess nutrients fuel massive, rapid growth of algae.
Okay, but lots of algae. Sounds like food. Why is that bad?
It seems counterintuitive, but when all that extra algae dies, the bacteria and fungi that decompose it use up vast amounts of oxygen dissolved in the water.
Okay. The decomposers breathe up all the oxygen.
Basically, yes. This is measured as biochemical oxygen demand, or BOD.
Hmm.
If the BOD gets too high, oxygen levels can drop so low that fish, insects, and other aquatic life just suffocate. You get dead zones.
Yikes. So too much good stuff like nutrients can actually kill the ecosystem.
In effect, yes. It drastically changes the community structure, often shortening food chains too. While it can't happen naturally, human activity massively accelerates it.
Okay. What about pollution like chemicals, toxins?
Yes, biomagnification is a big concern there.
Biomagnification.
Yeah, it's where certain toxins, things like the pesticide DDT or heavy metals like mercury, become more and more concentrated as you go up the food chain.
More concentrated. How does that work?
Okay, imagine tiny organisms absorb a little bit of the toxin from the water or sediment. Then a small fish eats lots of those tiny organisms. That toxin builds up in the fish's tissues.
Okay.
Then a bigger fish eats lots of those small fish. All the toxin from the small fish accumulates in the bigger fish, reaching a higher concentration.
And so on, up the chain.
Exactly. So the top predators, birds of prey eating fish or large predatory fish themselves, can end up with incredibly high, potentially lethal levels of these toxins.
Wow. So the guys at the top get the biggest dose.
That's the problem. And it's different from bioaccumulation, which is just the buildup in one individual over its lifetime. Biomagnification is the increase between trophic levels.
Got it. Okay. And what about plastic? We see plastic pollution everywhere.
A huge, huge problem. The main issue is that most plastics just don't break down naturally, or they do so incredibly slowly. They persist.
So they just hang around.
For potentially hundreds of years. You have
Yeah.
the obvious problems with larger pieces, macroplastics entanglement, animals getting trapped.
Yeah, the pictures of turtles or seals caught in nets. Horrible.
Exactly. And then there's ingestion. Animals
Yeah.
mistaking plastic for food. It can fill their stomachs, lead to starvation. And then you have microplastics.
The tiny bits.
Yeah, tiny fragments, often invisible. They get into everything: soil, water, air. And there's a lot of research now looking at whether these microplastics and the chemicals they might carry also accumulate and potentially biomagnify up food chains.
Another worrying thought. Okay, what about just taking stuff? Like fishing or logging?
Unsustainable resource harvesting, yeah.
Yeah.
That's definitely a threat. The key word is sustainable.
Meaning?
Sustainability basically means you can keep doing something indefinitely. For harvesting resources, it means the rate at which we take them out has to be less than the rate at which the resource can regenerate or replace itself.
So don't take more than nature can put back.
Exactly. If harvesting rates are too high, the population or resource dwindles, potentially collapses, and the ecosystem is damaged.
Can you give an example of doing it well and not so well?
Sure. Forest management in Finland is often mentioned as a more sustainable model. They have laws requiring replanting after logging, aiming for continuous forest cover.
Okay.
On the flip side, the collapse of the North Atlantic cod fishery is a classic example of unsustainability. Fishing pressure was just way too high for decades, the cod couldn't reproduce fast enough, and the stocks crashed dramatically. It devastated the ecosystem and communities that depended on it.
A stark warning. So finding that balance is critical. What about farming, agriculture? It feeds us, but can it be unstable?
Absolutely. Certain intensive agricultural practices can be unsustainable and damage ecosystems. Things like soil erosion, losing precious topsoil, leaching where nutrients from fertilizers wash away, causing problems like eutrophication downstream.
Right, we talked about that.
The need for lots of external inputs like fertilizers and pesticides, which themselves can cause pollution, and the overall carbon footprint associated with machinery, transport, and even livestock. All these can degrade the land and surrounding ecosystems over time.
It feels like so many essential human activities have these potential environmental downsides we need to manage carefully.
That's the challenge, finding sustainable ways to meet human needs.
Now, something else that came up was the idea of keystone species. What makes them so special for stability?
Keystone species are species that have a disproportionately large effect on their environment relative to their actual abundance. Their impact is much bigger than you'd expect just based on how many of them there are.
Okay, so they punch above their weight, ecologically speaking.
You could say that. If you remove a keystone species, it can cause a cascade of negative effects, sometimes leading to the collapse or dramatic transformation of the entire ecosystem. They often play unique, critical roles.
Like what kind of roles? Can you give an example?
The American beaver is a fantastic example in North America.
Beavers, how are they keystones?
By building dams. Those dams create ponds and wetlands where there were none before.
Ah, right. Creating whole new habitats.
Exactly. Those beaver ponds provide critical habitat for countless other species: fish, amphibians, insects, birds, mammals. They also alter water flow, trap sediment, improve water quality. They fundamentally engineer the landscape and boost biodiversity.
So take out the beavers.
And you could lose those entire wetland ecosystems in many areas.
Yeah.
There's also a famous experiment with sea stars. Removing a predatory sea star from a rocky shore led to a huge drop in the diversity of other species because mussels, which the sea star ate, took over completely.
Wow. So removing just one piece can make the whole structure fall apart. It really underlines how interconnected things are.
Absolutely.
So given all these threats and complexities, is there hope? Can we help damaged ecosystems become stable again?
Yes, definitely. There's a growing field focused on ecological restoration, and one really interesting approach is called rewilding.
Rewilding sounds wild. What is it?
Yeah. It's essentially about trying to restore ecosystems to a more natural, self-regulating state, often by stepping back and reducing human management.
Stepping back.
Yeah, letting natural processes take over more. This can involve several things. Sometimes it means actively reintroducing species that have been lost, especially top predators or other keystone species.
Like bringing wolves back somewhere.
Exactly. That's a classic example.
Yeah.
It can also mean reconnecting fragmented habitats, maybe creating wildlife corridors so animals can move freely again, and generally managing the landscape to minimize human pressures and allow natural regeneration.
So it's about giving nature the reins back, maybe with a little nudge.
That's a good way to think about it. It's about restoring natural processes and complexity. There's a project in New Zealand, the Hainawai Reserve, which is a great example. They focused mainly on removing non-native grazing animals and controlling invasive plants, then letting the native forest regenerate naturally. It's been incredibly successful in bringing back native biodiversity.
That's really positive. Good to know there are ways to actively help recovery. Okay, so just to wrap up quickly for Mr. Martin's class, we've covered quite a bit today. We started with the basics for ecosystem stability: need energy, need nutrient cycling, need genetic diversity, and a fairly stable climate. Then we explored how ecosystems change through succession, that primary succession from scratch, secondary succession after disturbance, those interesting cyclical patterns, and the idea of a climax community, but also how human actions can cause arrested succession.
Right.
Then we dove into the less cheerful part, the many ways humans threaten stability: deforestation like in the Amazon, eutrophication, pollutants biomagnifying up the food chain, plastic mess, taking too many resources unsustainably, and unsustainable farming practices.
And the crucial role of keystone species in holding things together.
Yes. Can't forget the keystones like the beaver. And finally, we touched on hope with the idea of rewilding, letting nature heal itself.
And for all of you listening, especially you IB biology students, understanding these connections, how energy flows, how nutrients cycle, how species interact, how humans impact it all, it's so fundamental, not just for your course, but for understanding the planet's challenges.
Absolutely. It's all interconnected. So maybe a final thought to leave you with, something to discuss perhaps. Given everything we know that ecosystems can be stable for incredibly long times, but also how much pressure we're putting on them now, what do you think are the absolute most crucial actions we need to take to help ensure ecosystem stability for the future?
That's a big, important question to ponder. And hey, if you found this deep dive useful or interesting today, please do hit like, subscribe if you haven't, maybe leave a comment with your thoughts, and definitely tell your friends or classmates about us.
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks for joining us.